It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. On Monday morning, Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton addressed the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee, also known as AIPAC. She affirmed that the U.S.-Israeli strong military alliance and vowed to reestablish sanctions on Iran if provoked. Let's have a look.
That's why I believe we must take our alliance to the next level. I hope a new 10-year defense memorandum of understanding is concluded as soon as possible to meet Israel's security needs far into the future. That will also send a clear message to Israel's enemies that the United States and Israel stand together, united. It's also why, as president, I will make a firm commitment to ensure Israel maintains its qualitative military edge.
Bernie Sanders, her Democratic opponent, was also invited to speak at AIPAC, but he declined, and he attended various campaign meetings in Utah on Tuesday. But while there, he did deliver a speech on his Middle East policy. Let's have a look.
Israel is one of America's closest allies, and we as a nation are committed not just to guaranteeing Israel's survival, but also to make sure that its people have the right to live in peace and security. To my mind, as friends, long-term friends with Israel, we are obligated to speak the truth as we see it. And that is what real friendship demands, especially in difficult times. Our disagreements will come and go, and we must weather them constructively. But it is important among friends to be honest and truthful about differences that we may have. America and Israel have faced great challenges together. We have supported each other, and we will continue to do just that as we face a very daunting challenge, and that is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I am here to tell the American people that if elected president, I will work tirelessly to advance the cause of peace as a partner and as a friend to Israel. But to be successful, we have also got to be a friend not only to Israel, but to the Palestinian people. Where in Gaza, unemployment today is 44%, and we have there a poverty rate which is almost as high. So when we talk about Israel and Palestinian areas, it is important to understand that today there is a whole lot of suffering among Palestinians, and that cannot be ignored. You can't have good policy that results in peace if you ignore one side.
Joining me now to discuss the candidates and their positions on Israel-Palestine and the Middle East is Phyllis Bennis. She's also a fellow that directs the Internationalism Project at IPS. She's the author of many books, among them Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict, a primer, and the 6th revised edition is out now. Phyllis, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you, Sharmini.
So Phyllis, let's get your take on Hillary Clinton's speech at AIPAC first.
Well, Hillary's speech was exactly what everyone expected. She was pandering to the pro-Israel audience to the max available, I would say. She condemned Bernie Sanders for calling for a level playing field in any Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, despite the fact that the American people overall in every poll, and especially the base of the Democratic Party, all call for exactly that. They call for the United States to be an honest broker, something it has never been. She called for more arms, stronger support for Israel. There was essentially nothing that Israel could do wrong in her eyes in this speech. There was no mention of the occupation, no mention of the discrimination. I wouldn't expect her to use the term apartheid, but she had no acknowledgement that there was a conflict. This is all about Israel is our best friend, Israel is our closest ally, and that's it. That was the only issue on the table. She expected to get, and did indeed get, ovation after ovation a great deal of support from AIPAC and its 18,000 supporters who were gathered there. And this is exactly what we anticipated would happen.
And she actually made several references to an increased military alliance with the United States, and particularly she named the Pentagon. What did she mean by that?
Well, I think that she was referencing the discussions that are now underway about the amount of money the U.S. is going to give directly to the Israeli military for the next 10 years. The current 10-year agreement expires in 2018. Under that agreement, the Israeli military is given $3.1 billion a year of our tax money directly to the military, privileged in many ways, more than any other country receiving U.S. military aid. It's not only getting more than any other country, it's allowed to spend a large proportion of it, about a quarter of it, on its own research and development. All other countries are required to spend all of it buying U.S. equipment. Only Israel is exempted from that requirement. And the negotiations are now underway. The Israelis are asking for $40 billion over 10 years instead of $30 billion. So they would be getting more than $4 billion a year of our tax money directly to support their military, despite the State Department's own assessment of the pattern and practice of massive human rights violations by the Israeli military. So what Clinton was referencing here is that she would support a stronger military alliance. That means presumably she would support the $40 billion or perhaps even more in direct military aid.
And Phyllis, as I mentioned earlier, Bernie Sanders, although he didn't attend the AIPAC summit, did give a speech addressing Middle East policy. Your thoughts on it?
Well, Bernie Sanders' speech was particularly important, partly because of his decision not to speak at AIPAC. His official reason, I was too busy, I was campaigning in Utah, didn't make a whole lot of sense. I don't think anybody believed it. It was his cover story. He chose not to address the AIPAC convention, which was hugely important. There had been a lot of pressure on him not to go to AIPAC, not to pander, and his choice of refusing to go to AIPAC, I think, spoke volumes by itself before he even opened his mouth. His actual speech on the Middle East was very, very interesting. It was quite different than any other speech by any other of the candidates for president. Of course, he began with a series of regular statements about how close the alliance is between the U.S. and Israel. He is, after all, running to be the president of the empire, we might say. And yet, it was very, very different. He spoke about support for Israel, and he talked about how it was important that everyone in the world recognize the state of Israel. He did not go on to say that everyone must recognize Israel as a Jewish state, which has been a new demand by the Israeli authorities, particularly Prime Minister Netanyahu, saying everyone must recognize Israel as a Jewish state, therefore recognizing somehow the legitimacy of the massive legalized discrimination against all non-Jews, which mainly affects Palestinians. So it was very important that when he said people should recognize Israel, he did not say Israel as a Jewish state. There were some issues that I would disagree with Senator Sanders. He called for both sides to make compromises as if both sides were equally responsible, both the occupied and the occupier. But on the other hand, the bulk of his speech, where he was talking about Israel-Palestine, was very much focused on Israeli obligations and Israeli violations. He really distanced himself from Prime Minister Netanyahu, both on the question of the Iran deal. He talked about how whether or not Netanyahu supports the deal, there are others in Israel who do, indicating very clearly that he was not particularly concerned about disagreeing with the prime minister. And very interestingly, he talked about the fact that there are good people on both sides. And he said, and I quote here, there are despots and liars on both sides. I don't know any U.S. official who has ever acknowledged that there are despots and liars on the Israeli side. So that was kind of huge. Now,
and he encouraged Netanyahu to pull back on the settlements in his speech, which is also a very important position.
He actually made the comparison of West Bank settlements, which of course are huge city-sized, they're cities in the occupied West Bank and in occupied East Jerusalem. They have 30, 40, 50,000 residents, some of them, the larger ones. And he said that Israel would have to close some of those settlements. And he said, like Gaza, which was very important because, of course, in Gaza, there was the forced repatriation back into Israel proper of the 6,000 illegal Israeli settlers in Gaza back in 2005. And at that time, there was great opposition from those settlers. They made a big, it was a very dramatic removal by soldiers with screaming residents of the settlements being dragged from their homes. It was deliberately orchestrated to look as dramatic as possible. And the notion that Senator Sanders would call for a similar evacuation of West Bank settlements or East Jerusalem settlements that still exist and are just as illegal was really quite something. He also called directly for an end to the siege of Gaza. He referenced the high levels of unemployment and poverty in Gaza. And crucially, he talked about water, something that no one ever did. He talks about how Israel controls 80% of the water on the West Bank, the inequity of access to water. And he talked about international humanitarian law and how important it is for Israel to stop its violations. He spoke directly of the disproportionate use of force by Israel in the war against Gaza in 2014, saying that while, of course, I stand opposed to the rockets that were fired from Gaza by Hamas into Israel, there was no excuse for this kind of disproportionate force, and he recognized it as a violation of international humanitarian law. So again, while the speech from my own vantage point was perhaps incomplete in terms of recognizing, as he put it, that the Palestinian goal should be to end the violence rather than trying to end the Oslo agreements. He didn't recognize that the real goal is to end occupation. He did speak of occupation. He did speak of ending occupation in another context. So it was really quite an extraordinary departure from the approach to Israel of every other candidate.
And speaking of every other candidate, I saw that Bernie Sanders also took opportunity to mention that of all the presidential candidates that are running in this election, he was the only one to perhaps have spent some time in a kibbutz. I thought that was an interesting note. And also, this leads me into your assessment on whether this was a smart move on the part of Bernie Sanders not to attend AIPAC and seize that moment of his kinship with Israelis and Jews in this country.
Absolutely. I think that the focus of the Sanders campaign has been very, very sharply focused on his main issue, which is economic inequality and the need for holding banks and Wall Street accountable. That's a hugely important issue. But it isn't the only issue in the world. And there's been quite a bit of concern among many of his supporters that he hasn't yet really taken on foreign policy. So to do it in this very powerful, evocative moment of saying no to AIPAC, something that's very, very unusual. You know, last year, Sharmini, when we had 60 members of Congress skipping the speech by Netanyahu in the joint session of Congress, that was huge. That was unprecedented. And for a presidential candidate to skip the AIPAC speech, that's in many ways a follow-on to that. So I think it was very important. It was also important that he spoke not only about Israel-Palestine, but he spoke about the broader issues of the wars in the Middle East, and again, distinguished himself significantly from the other candidates. He talked significantly in terms of time used in his speech about the importance of diplomacy over war. He repeated that over and over again in the context certainly of the Iran nuclear deal, but also in terms of the recent cessation of hostilities in Syria. He talked about the importance of opposing wars for regime change, and he recognized, interestingly, that not only the Iraq War, which he had long ago opposed, was a bad thing, that he said, when you're as powerful as we are, it's easy to depose a dictator. It's not so easy to deal with what comes after. He also said that the U.S.-NATO strikes in Libya that had led to the absolute violence and chaos that is now engulfing Libya was the same thing as the Iraq War. They were both disastrous, and they were both designed for regime change that had a terribly negative result. So that was a very important recognition. He also pulled back from his earlier calls. He's made some, I think, very problematic calls in the past for Saudi troops to go after ISIS in Iraq or Syria. And this time he pulled back from that significantly. He said there do need to be local Muslim-dominant countries that must provide military support, but that no country should engage unilaterally, and that no country should engage for sectarian motives in this context. It's problematic that he still assumes there can be a military defeat of ISIS, which I think is not true. But he pulled back from his earlier calls for Saudi Arabia or other specific countries to send troops. So that was an important move. And he recognized that it will take diplomacy and not war, diplomacy specifically engagement with Iran and Russia, the top supporters of the Assad regime in Syria, to transition away from that regime. That war, regime change, was not going to do it.
All right, Phyllis, a lot more to unpack there, and looking forward to having you back to do that.
Look forward to it.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.